this House, as this House believes that universities should never prohibit research or teaching on grounds of sexist, racist, or otherwise discriminatory implications. My name is Will Jones. With me, I have Bryce Balcom, Philip Bolesky, Toshiaki Ikehara, and Simona van Els. Your teams are, in opening government, Yale. In opening opposition, Glasgow University Union. Yes. In closing government, University College Cork Philosophical Society. And I will remind all the audience right now that I will start timing speeches regardless of whether or not they wish to shout for 30 seconds. In closing opposition, Harvard. I'm going to make the perhaps dangerous assumption that you are all familiar with the standing orders by now. Suffice to say that Toshi will make the following noise to indicate the beginning and end of protected time. And he'll do that twice in 7 minutes, which means shut up. Are there any questions? Wonderful, in which case it gives me enormous pleasure to call on the Prime Minister to open the case that stands in his name.
Mr. Speaker, we may be the only team here without a cheering section, but we plan on winning today's debate. And the reason why is as follows. Because when it was the case that we did not know whether HIV was a disease that only infected homosexuals or whether it could also infect people who are heterosexual, the research that went into determining that it affected people of all sorts of sexual persuasions could have been determined at the outset to have sexist implications if it had in fact been found that it only affected homosexual individuals. However, that research ended up being instrumental in actually helping to fight the terrible affliction that HIV is, and we don't think we would ever want to chill that sort of research. I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the importance of absolute academic freedom regarding academically valid work. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the chilling effect of this incredibly valuable research that restricting sexist work might have. And finally, I'm going to tell you why the best way to counter potentially sexist or racist beliefs is in fact to grant them a legitimate foundation and then destroy them with counter-speech. Max is going to tell you about how you can never in fact protect interests of sexism or racism when it is entrenched interests who are deciding what counts as sexist or racist. That said, I want to briefly outline how we're going to model today's debate. We think the model is fairly self-explanatory, but I want to be very clear about a couple of things. So, we think that work would still be reviewed by peers and by boards for validity and potential value, and would not receive any sort of funding, and would not necessarily be granted any platform unless it believed it may in fact be valid. Moreover, we think it would still have to meet ethical standards regarding experimental methodology and these sorts of content. But moreover, give me 1 minute, we want to make very clear that there is a difference between baseless racism and sexism and academic theories or research that may be interpreted to have discriminatory implications. We are not okay with professors standing up in the classroom and saying African Americans are inferior, that women are inferior, but we are okay with them teaching theories that may suggest that there might be mental differences between these groups, even though there might be an implication in that that could be interpreted to be sexist. Clarification?
So if there's research on a topic which has previously yielded many negative results, which has problems with its research but is nonetheless accepted by a niche specialist journal, are you saying you wouldn't allow that research to go forward if it failed to meet various standards you're setting forth?
So I didn't totally understand that question because it was incredibly unclear the way you framed it, but I want to be very clear. We are okay with all valid research being published insofar as the conclusions it comes to are academically grounded. So the first thing I want to talk about is the importance of absolute academic freedom regarding academically valid work. So we should all know this in this room, that we can never assume that we always know everything about a particular subject or topic. We think that also includes the potential moral or ethical implications that a work might have. At every point in human history, people have assumed that they have the best existing knowledge on a particular subject and have consistently been proven wrong. We think the purpose of academia is to shed light on the true nature of a subject or a topic. However, we don't think you can ever do that without access to all valid information. And we think specifically what we're talking about in this case is information that is academically valid. We think on opposition bench, you exclude that information from the discussion. We think taboos are bad because excluding certain information actually prevents us from making discoveries that may shed light on the way things actually are and allow us to have more information about the true nature of the world. We don't think there is value in denying something that is truthful regarding the world, and we think it's important that academia has the ability to access all of this information. We might not be able to see the specific harms today, just as when they prevented someone like Galileo from making claims that were against the Catholic Church, they couldn't see the potential harms of that at the time. That's because we don't know what discoveries might be made. We think it's important to allow all this information into the discourse so we can make those discoveries and prove whether or not they're correct or wrong. But moreover, we think that side opposition is problematic because they require an a priori judgment on what the implications of research are and what the results are actually found out. I think that's incredibly problematic because you can interpret works in multiple ways, but moreover, often you don't know what the results are going to be when you set out on actually putting out that research. But moreover, we think it's the case you have circumstances where it's very important, even for research that may be positive for women or positive for minorities, to allow researchers to counter to that so we don't have incorrect conclusions brought about regarding these things. For instance, we think it might be the case that you have a study which is conducted which finds the achievement gap between men and women in science is caused by differences in teaching methods. Another study might believe that not to be the case. They might find evidence to the contrary. And while that second study might be right, we think it's important that it might also be interpreted to have sexist implications so they don't provide a countervailing argument as to why it is the case that there's an achievement gap, and thus could be interpreted to say that the achievement gap is merely a mental difference. We think it's incredibly important that other study is allowed to get out so you don't have false conceptions of why it is that there's an achievement gap being widely spread if you can't actually have the speech in the discussion to counter those ideas even when it's correct. But the second thing I want to talk about is the chilling effect on incredibly valuable research. We think even if you believe that academic freedom ought not be absolute or is not that important, we think there's a very, very fine line between what can and cannot be interpreted as sexist or racist. However, we think that work into the reason why there are gaps between people of different genders, different races, or different sexualities is incredibly important. I mean, there are problems like differences in life expectancy, different in medical outcomes, and difference in achievement gaps, which are all problems in our society that we want to be able to fix. And all of these things might be interpreted to have racial or sexual implications if it is in fact, if you get a null result in saying that some other thing, other than say an innate difference, is the explanation for those gaps. This means we get to the chilling of a lot of research into these subjects, period. Why? Because people often stake their entire career on a very specific field and a very specific field of research. We don't think they want to risk the fact that the research they put many, many years into might be denied on that basis, or that their career might not be able to advance on that basis. But moreover, people don't know the outcome of their research at the start, so they might not enter into that research in the first place. That's incredibly problematic because it doesn't allow us to conduct this research, which will actually allow us to target these problems in the first place. But the final thing I want to talk about is why the best way to counter these beliefs is to grant them a legitimate foundation and destroy them at the counter stage. So recognize, Mr. Speaker, that we think there are people who are going to believe sexist or racist things regardless of what you do, regardless of what the academic society does. However, we think it's particularly important to recognize that these people will believe these things to be true and they believe that there is a legitimate basis for them if there isn't the ability to actually investigate them academically, because they will say, yes, these things are true, we simply can't prove it because we're not even allowed to investigate them. However, I think that when you allow them legitimate practice, we then allow other peers in the subject to actually counter these ideas. We need to allow other people to say these things are not true and provide proof of that. And I say that's true, and I think a perfect example of this was the debate regarding whether AIDS was a homosexual disease. It wasn't until the case that we actually got research on this that was disproven and actually undermined a lot of anti-homosexual rhetoric that was occurring throughout the world. For all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we are very, very proud.
I'd like to thank that gentleman for that speech, and now call on the Leader of the Opposition from Glasgow.
Right, so opening government come up to us today and they say that opening opposition are ultimately going to make an a priori judgment about what constitutes legitimate research, what constitutes a legitimate thing to investigate. Yet at the same time, they enforce this requirement of validity before something is able to be put onto an academic platform, before something is able to be published as academic research. We see that as every bit as much an a priori judgment as, for example, objecting on perhaps more subjective grounds. We do not therefore accept that they have set this debate up in the correct paradigm. But moreover, we see that the examples that they give us are those where actually we perhaps would be able to permit these sort of pieces of publications to take place. It is not our burden to suggest that in absolutely all cases research should not have some sort of potentially discriminatory implication. What we are merely saying is that the nature of the function of universities, and particularly in the search of truth and in the search of a better paradigm within the context of scientific endeavour, it may in some respects, in particular circumstances, be justified to intervene to prevent the endorsement and propagation of particular forms of research. What I'm going to bring to you first of all is how this fundamentally alters the ability of universities to control their reputations, to be able to foster a positive reputation and to build up their credibility within the academic world. And secondly, I'm then going to look at the broader effect on societal discourse and how fundamentally reassessing things that we have already demonstrably proved to be false to all intents and purposes must therefore actually be allowed to be prevented in certain circumstances. So first of all, this idea of reputations of universities. What we see is that fundamentally universities universities serve two functions fundamentally. First of all, we recognise that yes, they are businesses. We see that ultimately, particularly in the United States, they serve to kind of produce a particular form of output, and this is essentially the selling of goods and information. And we see that there is a particular value of that within the market. What we see, therefore, is that it may, in some cases, be in the interest of a university to protect its reputation for particular scientific endeavour by saying the particular things that have been proven, for example, to be demonstrably false by study after study after study, therefore not to allow further use of resources in order to meet those sort of things, instead to allow resources to be channeled into things that they think perhaps are less certifiably true. Moreover, we recognise that if they are fundamentally held to this standard, we see that fundamentally the kind of ability to get an overall increase in value of information actually depreciates. We see when everybody is ultimately forced to play it safe, it's essentially to play it safe because they ultimately can't control, they can't have any sort of control of the information that's going out. They then lose inherent kind of brand value. See, that's fundamentally harmful. But moreover, we see that universities serve this kind of second function over and above things that perhaps things like think tanks would serve. We see that universities also have this kind of existential function, where there's a kind of moral obligation in search of truth. We see that they are actually receptacles of kind of broader social information which is not simply pursued on an individual basis, but which reflects some sort of institutional memory. We see that in the pursuit of truth, we recognise that certain paradigms, particularly within the scientific method, are fundamentally certainly rejected. One key example might be perhaps links between race and IQ. One example in Edinburgh University where there was essentially a professor who pursued this sort of research, despite the fact that there have been many, many, many studies to the contrary that have credibly established that IQ is not inherently linked to race. You see that fundamentally there is a prior political objective behind that, and that even if you can have some sort of filtering with notional validity of research, we see ultimately that's going to slip through the net. And why is that going to slip through? I'll take you in a minute. It's going to slip through the net because ultimately all forms of publication aren't necessarily subject to particular scientific rigor. You have private journals, they still exist, but you can get some credibility through the auspices of university. If you're hiving off the idea that a university is able to actually have some sort of reputation in the first place, that legitimises those views even though they are fundamentally false. I ask you in side proposition, why do you think that's successful?
So there are two circumstances. Either everyone agrees something is demonstrably false and this research isn't going to change or harm anything, or this is a serious academic question.
No. I take your point. The point is, with frank journals, what you see particularly within kind of ill-informed communities and kind of minorities, see it with things like climate change, you also see it with things like bigotry in regards to kind of equal marriage. But fundamentally what you see is that these people use these journals, no matter what their veracity, to reinforce their opinions and actually help propagate those views and give the impression that somehow it's still part of the legitimate debate. Now what happens when you accept that it's part of the legitimate debate? Suddenly you're not making the kind of progress that you would otherwise be able to make. Once we recognise that things are demonstrably false within the context, particularly of scientific method, we have these kind of paradigms that ultimately emerge. Once we realise that the dichotomy between two particular alternatives is no longer viable, we then say, okay, one of them is not viable, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the other one is true. We think that we can fundamentally challenge that one. But if the discourse is still restrained to the discussion that's happening before, where we've fundamentally disproved one of them, then that means that actually you don't get any scientific advancement, you don't get any advancement in discourse, you don't get advancement in the fundamental ideas that we're actually taking into this. Why is that particularly harmful? Because it undermines the very idea that we're pursuing truth. Instead of being seen to be pursuing truth, what we seem to be pursuing is something which is the thing that can most popularly be accommodated by society. Sometimes truth is going to be something that fundamentally challenges basic prejudices and norms. And we see that if you're limiting yourself to a kind of almost intellectually stunted debate with something of a straw man proposition to what is perhaps the new consensus, we see that we don't get any genuine development in that sense. But moreover, even if we accept, the idea that we've got from the opening proposition that this kind of creates some sort of chilling effect, we see that fundamentally some voices within academic society, it is legitimate to discredit it. We see that there's actually a moral obligation on universities specifically to discredit and to take steps not to facilitate particular forms of research. Because we see that universities, in fulfilling their kind of moral duty, actually serve as particularly important actors within the broader scientific debate, within the broader sociological debate. It's not simply the case of being able to have an open and frank discussion and dismissing these views precisely because you're not necessarily dealing with intelligent, informed persons when it comes to the interpretation and dissection of this research. Until you have ultimately a discourse where science and sociology are able to lead and able to inform from a basis of prior knowledge, we fundamentally see that you're not able to make any serious advancement. Until side proposition can demonstrate to us why it is going to be the case that you can make some sort of validity criteria that does not actually, in fact, amount to side opposition's case that universities can intervene, we fundamentally see that they have failed to support their side of the motion. If they cannot support their side of the motion, you must side with us. For these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you.
I'd like to thank that gentleman for his remarks. That door. And call on the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government.
Alright. I want to start by being very clear about the burdens for this round and the arguments that they're making about validity of crime. So they say it's not their burden in this round to defend that this research happened in all cases. They say that they can just carve out a limited subset of cases in which university administrators could exercise discretion. The problem with that is it assumes that the discretion that those people exercise would be perfect discretion, that they would know which cases would have the implications that they're talking about. What I represent in positive matter is why having those entrenched interests decide which cases are good and bad for minorities will not ultimately be in the best interest of those minorities. So I don't think they can just look to discretion as the end-all be-all for this round, because that discretion can and has been abused. And even if it weren't being abused, it's just hard to tell. Like, even if they were doing it in a good faith effort, they may just get it wrong. We think it's a difficult question to do this a priori, and that's exactly what Ben did. The next thing they talk about in terms of the burdens is this notion of validity. And they say, well, we're being hypocritical because we impose a constraint that research has to be like academically grounded in evidence. So the academic community imposes this constraint in the status quo. Published article in a journal that says, I rolled marbles around in a jar, and then I decided that there's like a fundamental difference between the races. Like, obviously, these things are imposed in the status quo by the academic community, and we think that those are the same types of regulations that we're talking about on our side of the house. Their response to this was about crank journals, where they said that there are some journals who will publish bad stuff like this regardless. But I think that in that case, if an academic literally has only ever been able to publish their stuff in crank journals, a university does not have to give them tenure or fund them. Like, when we hire academics, we can consider the quality of their research, and if they can't publish a single article from their research in reputable journals because it is not grounded, then I think that those views don't ultimately get out in the academic discourse. I think the view of the academic discourse is very bizarre, and that's what I want to talk about in my next point of rebuttal. Because what they say is that this is harmful to the university reputation because the people in the university will just continue to publish things that are demonstrably false over and over and over again with no grounding. Mr. Speaker, that is not the way that the academic discourse works. Look, either these things are demonstrably false, in which case there is no grounding for the things saying the opposite direction, in which those things do not get published in legitimate academic journals and often can't even make it into crank journals because there's literally no evidence for them. Or these things are not demonstrably false precisely because the research in the opposite direction is still getting published, and at that point it's a legitimate academic debate that I would want to play out so that academics can decide which way this goes. He says that this means on our side of the house that there will be no advancement in the academic community. But I actually think the argument goes the other way around. Like, the academic community has been quite successful at rejecting views that were demonstrably false. It's not like physics is still stuck 400 years in the past because academics had entrenched views in like Newtonian mechanics being the only thing that should ever exist. Obviously, when evidence is used in these academic debates, people do sort this out. But on their side of the house, they have all of the effects that Ben talked to you about cutting off the potential for future discoveries when you just censor an entire field of research. We think that you may not know what those discoveries might be, so that benefit might be hard to imagine right now, but that doesn't mean those discoveries couldn't exist in the future, as with the example that Ben gave about the implications of having censored Galileo, and we think that that is still a massive harm in this regard. The next thing that they talk about is how the reputation of the university will be hurt because it's like going to be associated with these bad views. So the first thing that I would say is the reputation will likely recover in the long run. Like, we don't think that legitimate academic research is likely to say things that are going to be absolutely horrible for the university's reputation in the long run. We think it might be misinterpreted at first, as with Ben's example about AIDS research, but we think ultimately those misinterpretations are corrected as the academic discourse that I was talking about progresses towards truth. But moreover, we think that the university also has a moral obligation to consider the interests of society above merely its selfish concerns about its own reputation. Universities stand for this academic freedom. They stand for people's rights, and they stand for the advancement of knowledge in society. And we think that the university ought to consider the interests of society in making those discoveries that Ben talked about more than their own reputation. But even then, we still think that the harms to their reputation are completely temporary. I'll take that.
You say we should care about the interests of society, but what happens if there's research that comes out that actually has damning social effects based on the implication? Not all information is good information.
I don't think that most research is going to have damning social effects. I think insofar as there were research that came out, for example, about a difference between races or genders, that society needs to know that if that were actually true, we need to take corrective steps to counterbalance the effects of that disparity. So, for example, if research came out saying like men and women learn somehow differently, and that was what was behind this achievement gap in science, that can be seen on face as sexist because it's talking about the differences in the way that they think. But in fact, we could reform our system such that it wasn't biased in its way, that it was teaching towards men rather than towards women, if that were actually the case. Society's systems, if that research were actually true, could be corrected to be less discriminatory, and we would want to know about it. That would be better in the long run. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of rebuttal is this notion of accepting this as part of debate as legitimizing these really sexist views. So I think that there are a few kinds of people here. There are some people who are just going to believe what they're going to believe, regardless of the scientific debate about it, and those people aren't going to have their minds changed by this academic discourse. But there are some people who think that one side of the argument in this case hasn't gotten a fair shake because it hasn't been allowed to have academic research about it. We think that when this academic debate plays out, and keep in mind, academic debates involve evidence in a way that most don't. We think that that evidence is going to show those people that those views that they believed before are demonstrably false, and now that those views have been given their say and have been proven wrong by that evidence, we think that that is different. So the university does not have a moral duty to discredit it. In fact, what will discredit it is putting it out in the open, like Ben told you, and letting the counter-speech happen. Now I want to talk about my new positive matter about entrenched interests. So I think that the university administrators are going to be bad at exercising the discretion they want. We've already showed you why, even if they were able to just exercise it in those cases, why it would still be a harm because of all of the research it cuts off and because the counter-speech would be better. But I think it's going to extend to cases that they don't want it to under their discretionary view. Why is that? Two reasons. Well, first, I think there's a cognitive bias because you don't represent minority views on university administrations. They're often white, they're often male, and they often represent entrenched interests, and they don't necessarily understand the full perspective of this. So I think there are different ways in which this might play out depending on the university administrator. They may over-censor things that they just think are tangentially related to sex or gender because they're afraid that it would have sexist implications. You think that could be bad. They may also under-censor things because they're not sensitive to the plight of these people who would be, they may be confused about the way that they would do this. We think that obviously they shouldn't be censoring things, but we think that they may use their discretion poorly in that regard, and they may fundamentally come to the wrong decisions about this. We also think, though, that they may just be corrupt. That people may just want to entrench their own careers because academics often have a vested interest in promoting that. And we think if this is something that you can do to their rival, cut off their field of research, you might actually do it within your university. So we've shown you why it would be bad to do this, even if they could just limit it to the set of cases that they want. But I think inherent to this debate is the necessity of an absolute prohibition to prevent those harms of extending it to a broader set of cases and having the wrong people decide which research exists and does not within the university. We think that is an incredibly perverse way to treat academic freedoms. It is against the society rights that the university stands for, and we are proud to
I'd like to thank that gentleman for his speech, and now call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
We really think it might have been a mistake of First Proposition to predicate their case on the belief that nothing is ever published which is demonstrably false. This is demonstrably false. Our first example, there are published articles which claim to show that homosexuals make bad parents. This is demonstrably false. Why is this demonstrably false? Because in an overwhelming number of articles where the possible alternatively affecting variables are controlled for, there is shown to be no difference between the abilities of homosexuals and the ability of heterosexuals to raise children. But unfortunately, one study in one journal at one point published a finding that said, look, homosexuals make worse parents. You know this is true because you're debaters. Therefore, in preparation of debates about whether or not homosexuals should be allowed to adopt, etc., you may well have even referenced this. But even if you don't, it's the case that every time you see a public debate on the question of the rights of homosexuals, this finding is referenced. The trouble is that there is a disproportionate impact of this research, especially when it's bad research, but even when it's good.
Sorry about that.
No. First proposition wants to limit their case to where it is not known to be false, but is known to be invalid a priori. We question them, okay, well, what is your criteria for validity? So in other words, if it was possible to, say, manipulate this debate in order to eliminate all the journals who don't necessarily, properly regulate academic research or don't have the right to p-values to show, expansively small, like particularly small error bars, then it'd be a case that this would be a non-debate. We would just be having a debate about whether or not research should be published, right? There needs to be some adherence to the fact that the key cases in this debate are cases like the one Graham gives you, which I'm now going to discuss exhaustively. In Edinburgh, rather embarrassing for us, given we're representing Scotland, it was the case that there was a statistics professor who kept on publishing research saying that there was a negative correlation between Africans and low IQ. That Africans just naturally, people who are black and from Africa were just naturally of low IQ. Obviously, if that research was believed, it would have negative implications because when you looked at the differential attainment of African Americans and white people, you would say, well, there's no reason to necessarily devote the same resources to them because this is the result we would naturally expect from this disequilibrium. But when you look at the research it relies on, it invariably relies upon things like the Stanford Binet IQ test, which don't control for things like culturally specific variables. They use instead, the reputable research uses things like the Raven's progressive matrices, which is your ability to realize how to complete symbol formations on the basis of rules. In other words, something that doesn't require you to know about what happens in Western Europe or to have a very good understanding of English. When you use these alternative measures, it's the case that you see there's no race difference in IQ. What is the problem with this for this debate? They might say, well, okay, that means it fails to reach our validity standard. But the trouble is, they haven't specified what the validity standard is. They can't tell us that, oh, well, okay, it's only going to be when it's good research we're allowed to be published, but not when it's bad research. Again, there's no debate. The case that we're talking about is one where this man was fired. They say, well, we're still going to allow you to fire people if you do bad research. We point out that probably prohibiting someone from doing that research and saying, bog off, start going back to doing statistics, which is what we hired you to do, would probably be a lower standard, but we're happy to say that the man is fired.
Sorry.
They think they've got a freedom of speech argument. So some people might say, we vivify truth through the collision with error. We don't think this is true. Why not? Because we think there are some cases where we have nailed on the error, right? There are reasons that some people believe that people of a different race might have lower IQs. We know what those reasons are. There are natural inclinations that people have towards seeing people from other races as other than them, and naturally they want to emphasize the differences. So if they see, embarrassingly, that people from those other races have lower attainments in society, they have less wealth, they want to naturally excuse that and say, well, that's because they probably aren't as able. Therefore, we know what the motivations for people think these things are. And we also know that there's been a large number of negative results. Whenever you've controlled for the variables correctly, you get a negative result. A negative result is just as significant as a positive result. This is what they don't seem to understand. There are things that we know which nonetheless continue to get published and which have incredibly disproportionate negative consequences for societal discourse and for the people who are within those minority groups when that research is published. No, thank you. So, what kind of chilling effects do we see as happening as a result? Because they say, oh well, the trouble with this is it has a chilling effect, it means less research will be done. No, their case has a chilling effect. It has a chilling effect in a number of ways. Related research gets similarly impacted in terms of its reputation, right? Because they point to the research done on homosexuality and HIV, right? There might be good cases where something which does take into consideration race as a possible factor in relative rates of social attainment might be potentially good research to do. It might be an open question, but it is impacted if you also have someone at your same faculty who's been doing discredited race and IQ studies, right? The trouble is, there's a massive chilling effect there because it's less likely that people will read your research. They say, well, actually, it's good. It falls on our side of the house because neo-Nazis always read follow-up articles. So it's peer-reviewed research, so they'll always read the follow-up and, oh, well, the peer discredited. If that's true, there probably wouldn't be any neo-Nazis. there are, so we can argue it probably doesn't. No, thank you. It also has an impact on admissions, right? If you're a university, you want the best quality of candidates to apply for the post. I'll take closing if you want to give me one at the moment. No, I want to take closing.
Considering that the studies you talked about, for example, homosexual versus heterosexual parenting is already out there, how do we ever get any counterweight to that?
You get counterweight to that by publishing negative research, right? It's very easy. Like, well, okay. We already have negative research published in those fields. Like, we don't need we are only studying this in cases where we already have that negative research done, right? So we a priori don't need to do that research in the cases that we're talking about, right? So, like, in cases where it isn't settled, like, we might still do the research. In the cases where it is settled, we wouldn't, because the case is already settled. You need to cover all cases. That's what never means. Right? That's not how the finally, as we pointed out in the first speech, there's a reputational impact in the center. You have fiduciary obligations to people that fund your university, because universities are private bodies. We also have moral obligations to the people, though, both students of universities and alumni of the universities, to make sure that the research you're publishing does not have disproportionately high academic, society negative influence. As we point out, the one finding in the homosexual and child rearing case has had incredibly disproportionate negative impact relative to the many negative findings. So we think that overall, there is an obligation impending on universities to ensure that research which is going to have these implications is not published, especially when there has already been a wealth of negative research already published. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that gentleman for his speech and now call on the government member from UCC Philosophy.
I'm going to talk to you about three things. I'm going to talk to you about academic discourse. I'm going to ask the question, what happens if we get a positive answer? Finally, I'm going to talk to you about a society which is scared of the answers that we're going to get. First of all, quite a bit of rebuttal. Because when the last speaker fudged over Garrod's POI, we point out he's completely forgotten what society is. We're coming from a society that is already fundamentally biased. These ideas exist out there and we need to defeat them, right? We point out the only way to find the negative answers that he believed that we can find is if we ask discriminatory questions. Because we don't know the answers we're going to get before we do the research. That's the point of the research. Those discriminatory questions will be ruled out. We will find no way to get those negative answers, right? 6 points of rebuttal. First of all, this idea that we got from opening up, these universities want to protect their reputation. The only reputation that matters is their openness and their willingness to accept ideas. That's the purpose of a university, to improve societal discourse. Second of all, this idea, these people will use research regardless of its veracity. We point out, monopoly on research doesn't exist. Think tanks give out research. That's going to be a major crux of our case, right? Third of all, the idea of truth as being something that challenges basic norms. Something that points out that there might be an inherent difference in people challenges our basic norms, so it has to be accommodated, right? Fourth of all, assuming that these people are just going to be unintelligent and uninformed is just silly, first of all, but second of all, ignores the fact as to how they got posted at that university in the first place, and then finally the idea, they just assumed that research which comes out with the idea that people are different will just have damning social effects. They've never given us reasons why that's the case, especially given that society typically tolerates difference rather well. In fact, we're rather good at that, and we've used these stuff in the past for implications for public policy, right? We believe this can bring about better outcomes, okay? First of all, academic discourse, because they kind of ignore the fact that the purpose of universities behind it all is to provide a better idea of truth, and ultimately bring about the ideas that will change society. So first of all, it has to accommodate opinion which is critical of basic norms, otherwise we never get the answers that they want us to get, right? But second of all, that an awful lot of research can have actual political implications for the policies that we implement as a state, right? We point out that why it is necessary that research on discriminatory questions happens is so we can prove things, right? We point out you can't get a negative answer to a discriminating question unless you ask a discriminating question. As a result, when a university university stops you asking discriminatory questions, you never get the negative answers that we both agree are rather good, right? We'd also point out that when they point out that people sometimes have confirmation biases in the way that they look at information, we point out that the typical way that they look at something is that, yes, it sounds a bit strange, but it hasn't been ruled out. And if it hasn't been ruled out, you are more likely to err on the side of the values which have been infused in you from your birth, the values that were handed down to you by other discriminatory sources, right? Until you find something to counterweight that, you're never going to change your opinion, you're never going to remove that opinion, right? So, the second thing that we're going to talk to you about on this is the idea of a monopoly on research, because basically what we've assumed so far in this debate is that the only people who do research are people from universities, right? Their problem is that somebody's going to put out a study which has no academic validity, or which, for instance, comes back to a wrong answer, and as a result people are going to look at that. We point out think tanks still exist on their side of the debate. As a result, if you've got a biased interest in looking at a certain question, those answers are still going to be out there. The only difference is there's going to be no positive counterweight with academic validity to defeat those ideas, okay? So we point out and completely ignored that that is the case. The problems they've identified exist on their side as well, but they're just removing the ability for us to actually defeat them, right? We'd also point, when he gives a specific example of like, you know, gays being bad parents, we'd point out that on his side of the model, the question, on his side of the debate, the question, do homosexuals make good parents, is a discriminatory question. The only way you get the answer, homosexuals do not make bad parents, is if you ask the question. We're never going to get to ask the question in this debate right now. Right, okay. Because there's a massive assumption that like these ideas, that there might exist differences between people, will only exist when academics start asking those questions. No, the ideas exist right now, we need to defeat them. The only way we can defeat them is by asking those questions and getting negative answers, okay? Finally, what this does to the experimental method, because ultimately, when they gave us the idea of discretion, and that academic authorities are just going to, you know, make a decision as to which ones are worthy of doing. First of all, they don't know what's going to be useful when they start their research, but second of all, if you make a value judgment on what you want to show in an experiment before you make that experiment, then that affects your experimental methodology. It affects the veracity of the results that you get. If you start from biased premises, you're going to get biased answers, okay? We point out that that affects the validity of all academic research, including the research that already exists with negative answers that they want to protect so much, okay? Right, no. Okay, second point. What happens if we get a positive answer, right? Because we just had it assumed on the off bench that if we get a positive answer that there exist differences between people, it's just going to be horrendous for society. No analysis as to why that is the case, by the way. Here's some analysis why it won't be the case. We point out that society accommodates difference all the time rather than masking it. We point out that we recognise that there are certain differences between people and certain people need to be catered for in different ways than other people. So for instance, we target welfare provision at poor people, right? We pointed out the people who actually need things are the people that we help. We recognise their difference, don't we?
The difference between think tanks and universities is if I'm someone who's sitting on the fence, I'm much more likely to be university-published research than think tanks because of the reputation for truth that goes with it.
His premise when he made that point is that they're going to accept the report regardless of its academic veracity. Here, please tell me why they're not going to accept the think tank research, which is no academic veracity. How is that consistent with what you've actually said? Okay, right. What if we get a positive answer? Because we point out that there are significant minority lobby groups within the state who point out that their experience of society has not been the same as other people's, and as a result, their situation is entirely different, right? We point out that the impact of public policy on things like education, when we point out that there are differences in how people learn, for instance, or in how people have been left behind by the education system because now they're affecting their prospects. We point out this raises critical points about the cultural situation they were brought up in. It raises critical points about whether the state has failed those people. But secondly, it might highlight the unfortunate metric that we're using to gauge whether people are clever or not. If we come out with a research that says that one group of society is just better than another, it might highlight the metric that we were using for that is wrong. That allows academia to innovate, come up with better metrics which are more tolerant of difference, and as a result, improve academic research. But we point out that things like pointing out that males sometimes are worse drivers than women and come about into worse accidents, that's a discriminating question. And as a result of the answer that we got, which is that sometimes more males die behind the wheel than women do, we've been able to target those males and say to them, you should probably drive a bit safer. Difference is not something to be afraid of. It's not something society is afraid of. We are proud to propose.
opposition member rather to open the case for Harvard, maybe?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is sort of ironic that we have the entire front half of the debate, one half of the debate, which chooses to only talk about really one half of the issues in this debate. Because if you remember back what we heard at the very beginning of the round, we heard a debate which is about both research and teaching at universities, right? The word teaching was used like 20 seconds into the round and then disappeared completely from any discussion whatsoever. So much of my extension today is going to discuss why specifically this is a unique situation in which in the case of teaching, we should be not allowed to provide this information. But before that, some rebuttal to these questions of research, right? So first we get lots and lots of arguments coming on this terrible research way in which we need lots of information to be able to counteract bad ideas and counteract that stuff. The first valid response we hear to this is to say, well, we can make discerning decisions about when it is valid to counteract, say research can't be used, and when it isn't valid. One very good example of that is to say, if there is a substantial amount of evidence that currently exists in the status quo, which says X in from X, two groups are equal, then we shouldn't allow more research on that issue, because the upside of more research on that issue is essentially zero, but the downside of more research on that issue is enormous. But a couple of other reasons why this doesn't make sense. First, everyone in this round assumes that information, just as distributed, is interpreted in completely the wrong way. But the reality is that universities and other people are obligated for the potential perverse implications and understandings of the research that they distribute. This, by the way, is admitted by opening government, in which they say, look, these universities have a social obligation. They do research for a social obligation. But that assumes more information for social obligations simply is better. That doesn't make any sense. So the reality is that you have lots of individuals who potentially interpret this information in the wrong way and end up abusing that information. Why is that true? Well, because the truth is that most people right now who hold racist or sexist views don't hold those views based on lots and lots of research that they have read on those issues. That is to say, those are racist or sexist views that have been inculcated in them for some reason or another. That is to say that positive evidence which says, hey, those differences don't exist, is not likely to convince them. On the other hand, evidence which does show up and say, hey, your views are right based on scientific information, likely causes them to read it biasedly, to say, wow, I've got more information that proves my racist belief or my sexist belief. They double down on the information, they begin to sell it on to other people who themselves have been inculcated in that specific way, and they increase the likelihood that this is devastating for society. We hear this brilliant objection from closing government like, well, why is this stuff bad that people have sexist beliefs? What's the implication? Well, because you end up massively increasing the likelihood that individuals in society are alienated, that people lobby for policies that disadvantage individual races or disadvantage individual sexes as a result of all these kinds of implications. What's more, they assume that information in and of itself is good information. That is to say, you can get good information. But we say sometimes it is better off not knowing that information. Right? And this is, by the way, this is the POI that I generated based on the opening government speech, which is to say sometimes we should know information. He says, well, that's silly. If we know information like there are different teaching styles that advantage one group or another, then we have the opportunity to rectify against that. That's fine. What's the really, really kind of bad information that comes out? One that looks at the genetic code and says, hey, black people are simply less intelligent in these subjects, or women are simply not good in math in those subjects. That, by the way, doesn't tell us what's the teaching method of how can we rectify based on teaching method. It just says, look, an investment in these people in society is useless because they themselves are less likely to be successful. Yes, I'll take opening hat.
As Max told you, these bad articles will get published in crank journals and accepted by bigots, whether or not their authors are employed or funded by universities. The only impact of the Octo case is to protect reputable research.
So that's absurd, right? Because universities themselves still publish a massive amount of information. They still represent the majority of the funding in these cases. Second, that ignores the possibility this information would be misinterpreted. That is to say, it's not true. Third, we're saying it's not about the validity of the evidence itself, but the fact that it reaches a bad conclusion. So I don't care if it's evidence that comes from Yale that says black people are less good at X and Y and Z subject. It may be legitimate, but we shouldn't be publishing that shit. That's terrible. So let's go with the question of think tanks. Right? This is particularly important. So this is sort of the main extension argument here of think tanks, but there are three reasons why the think tank argument doesn't make sense. One, the role of the university is specifically unique. That is to say, regardless of the amount of information that comes out of these individual groups, because the university has an obligation to actually care for social costs in a way that other institutions, that doesn't matter. Two, they misunderstand what most think tanks do. Most think tanks don't end up focusing on the kinds of scientific research that deals with the particularly damning questions that we are talking about. Most of those are kinds of more broad social questions that don't have that implication. Third, they assume that that in fact just lots of examples is actually better. But the truth is there can be think tanks themselves which counterbalance the information that comes out. But we should remember the marginal impact of one additional paper on a given subject that's going to promote equality tends to be very, very low. On the other hand, the marginal impact of a single paper which comes to the wrong conclusion and says two groups are not equal is going to be devastating. That's why we shouldn't just defer to lots and lots more information. So, let's go with the extension arguments we believe are particularly important. That is to say, the obligation of teaching. Because, in fact, there are multiple types of universities that exist in the world, and they uniquely have individual obligations, their requirements. The first type is private universities. That is to say, universities that should be allowed to control the messages that they individually spread. So this is particularly important when you have, like, historically black colleges or universities which have specific religious affinities. That is to say, that because all the people who have chose to join that university have chose to consent into the system, and because the university has the control over the type of curriculum that's being distributed, we believe it's perfectly legitimate for them to decide, hey, this information is racist, this information can be understood as being sexist, and therefore we don't support and believe that kind of information is legitimate. So it's very clear, as long as they have to prove everyone, they can't prove private universities. But it's also particularly damning when it comes to public universities, because public universities means that professors are themselves agents of the state, and therefore we ought to hold them to a higher standard when it comes to the kind of information that they are distributing. Because if it's potentially going to be misinterpreted, that means that the state is the one supporting specific types of racism. This supercharges our arguments in two important ways. First, the nature of speech itself when it comes from a university classroom tends to be considered sort of the law, it tends to be considered much more legitimate than random speech that exists on the sidewalk, which means even if there is racist or sexist information, that information gets taught in university classrooms, that ends up boosting the likelihood that people will believe it. Second, this is particularly important when it comes from government institutions. That is to say, people are understood as being legitimately considered acceptable for the action that they're considered more important information because it comes from government agents themselves, right? The implication is that these governments are obligated for not only the information they give to people, but the way in which that information will be reinterpreted. So, there are lots of different cases we have to consider in this round. We have to consider both public and private universities, and because private universities have their own control, it seems simple. We also have to consider the fact that there might be bad information, and that itself will come to the wrong conclusions, and we don't want to risk it. But we also have to consider the chance that information might be misinterpreted. And the truth is, sometimes it's simply not worth taking that risk, which is why we should err on the side of saying some information is not acceptable.
I would like to thank those gentlemen for that speech, and now call upon the final speaker from the government.
Chair, fellow speakers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Your chanting says more than my analysis. I'm going to sum this debate under two main grounds. I'm going to talk about the importance of university research, and secondly, I'm going to talk about the outcomes that we're going to get. Firstly, in terms of how research happens, and secondly, in terms of the wider problem. Before that, I'll just do a couple of quick points about it. I don't quite fit everything else. Firstly, you have all down the opposition. They focused on this weird idea, to be honest, to us, that like what this is going to affect is, people are going to research things that have been generally accepted to be true, that aren't sexist or discriminatory, but they just want to go into it, and there could be no possible benefit to anything else, right? We'd say, like, for all research, if you have nothing new, right, if there's no new avenue, if you have no plausible hypothesis that there could be something new and interesting there, you won't get the funding anyway, right? We're not sure why this would be different for racist or discriminatory yourself anyway. There's not much research going into at the moment whether the Earth is still round, right? Unless somebody comes up with fantastic new theory, it's still not worked out, right? We don't think that's particularly relevant in this debate. The second thing, just the idea of teaching. We think, for something that was the crux of this debate, it came out quite late in today's speech, but I'll give a couple of small anyway. Firstly, the idea that this we see as like being coming straight from the government source. We'd say universities are often the most critical of governments and generally state, right? It's reasonably obvious to everyone in the room that like a lot of incredibly critical, important critical thinking comes from universities, right? So we don't think it will be seen as a government mandates, just as anything universities say isn't seen as a government mandates at the moment, right? But moreover, right, we don't think like students are just going to accept these things blindly anyway. Like, firstly, the idea of universities being like a source of critical thinking for young people anyway, right? That they're not supposed to be like that. But secondly, you're getting like a reasonably intelligent cohort of people going there anyway, right? If there are people like the statistics measure like being like blindly racist in classes. Like we don't think people are necessarily going to buy that. We think that's just going to massively damage the credibility of the person teaching the class anyway. We don't think it's particularly important in this debate. No, thank you. First point is the importance of university research, right? We think it's important to know, because we think the opposition has missed the context of this. By context, we mean like the society that we live in. We're still living in a patriarchal society. We're still living in the world that places some ethnicities at a disadvantage from the very start, right? There are so many people who have baseless stereotypes and opinions created often by the culture that they broke up in, right? So we're coming at this from a situation where pseudosciences actually affects lives negatively. Pseudoscience based on pre-existing opinions, right? We think we actually get a chance to counter research that takes place on a solid footing to help in the overall struggle to dispel these stereotypes and ultimately this culture, right? So now you'll be able to point to research and say, no, that assumption you're making based on race or gender is utterly baseless, is utterly useless, is utterly crap, right? We think we're coming from where we are, the research that we're going to get is going to have much more positive effects than negative effects, right? This is considering, like, this is the PY like Dunkery, like considering like research that they've talked about, like that affects our cultural stereotypes already existing, right? Like, however do we get a chance to discredit that? We think the response we got was some waffle about validity, that I'm going to deal with a little bit later, right? We think this is especially important, considering, and this is what Barry brought to you about the other sorts of research that exist, right? If considering we're denying the universities the opportunity to do this research, there will still be bodies that do so. Think tanks that publish in crime journals, right? That are already biased, they're already awful research, but now there's no opposition to that. They don't actually get a counterweight. The people who otherwise, we admit, like people do tend not to believe crime journals, but now they have no alternative to that, right? There is literally nothing saying that crime journal is wrong, right? We think the only response we got from opposition is there seems to be some slightly confused stuff about peer-reviewed journals, the differences there, right? We say, firstly, if your research is crap anyway, that's not going to change. Peer-reviewed journals don't actually have to publish everything, right? If your research methodology is obviously biased or flawed, it won't get published in the beginning. That's ability that applies to all publications, right? Moreover, it's something up from the last speaker about like the damage that one devastating counterexample can do, right? I think this is a bit massively overblown, to be honest, right? Because we still do have things like meta-studies. We still do have which take into account lots of different studies and create balanced stats. So we think like more research is generally a good thing anyway, right? But like look at examples where there have been counterexamples. Like for example, global warming. Firstly, over time they do get discredited. Secondly, they can actually have some positive effects. I.e., sometimes like we have actually overestimated the extent to which global warming has occurred. I'll give the example of the glaciers in the Himalayas. Like, so they can actually have beneficial effects. But yeah, so like we don't actually think they've affected the movement of people that believe in global warming. Yes, there are still fringe people there. But we think the extreme are going to latch onto these anyway. We think we're talking about the vast majority of society. People Barry gave you in his extension, we don't think have been dealt with effectively. We think that is the real debate here. We think that's it. We think that is important. I would take a PY before I want to.
Okay, so how would it affect either its ability to hold the G-Shock to account or your feelings about it? If you knew that UCC kept on studying again and again the question of whether African Americans or whether Native Africans were racially inferior because, as first prop thinks, it's still an open question.
Okay, so firstly, we think this is the fallacy that I've already dealt with, that somehow we would keep doing research into the same question again and again. Like the university we're talking about, we're assuming they're not stupid, right? So that's our first response there. But secondly, like when you're talking about things like criticism, like academic criticism, you tend to take the arguments into account, not whether there was somebody in the building 50 yards away doing some other research, right? We do tend to think like the main thrust of academic criticism, and in most intellectual criticism, does not tend to be like your like proximity to other people, but actually what you're saying. We don't think that effectively really matters, right? Secondly, the outcomes that we have. Firstly, how research happens, right? Let's look at the opposite. We can decide based on which stuff that have positive outcome in advance. Two things there. A, no we can't, right? Even plausible hypotheses need to be experimentally verified, right? And also need to fail again and again and again, right? So there is no certainty involved in experimental verification effectively, so you don't actually know. But even if you could know in advance, that would be a bad thing, right? As Barry tells you, because it tends to create a bias in your methodology. You begin to see what you want to see, right? Which is like, so you get bad research anyway. We say, like, you simply cannot, if you cannot ask discriminating questions, by which I mean questions that may or may like affect our views of things based on their outcome, you do not think you get their research. But how does the wider public see this? This is not Barry gave you, like a new debate from the purely academic world. I've heard there is a world outside university. Not that I know there's a particularly like to know, I suppose. But anyway, right? People who already hold this kind of racist or sexist behavior are going to see this as a confirmation of their views, right? Firstly, the universities are scared of what they might find, that they are running away from the real debate, much like some other people I might talk about, right? But secondly, especially pernicious, considering the type of people who are like already going to be naturally suspicious of state apparatus telling them about equality in other senses, right? So now when the state tells them, maybe you should have an equal hiring policy, stuff that is not actually related to that kind of criticism, they're going to naturally distrust that, right? Because they're going to see that the state is shutting down one side of the debate, and they don't see what they have to buy into anything else, right? Last thing, what if this does have the actual racist or sexist implications? So, taking their case it's stronger. Say they show that, Irish people are smarter than anybody else, right? We don't think our society should base its treatment of other human beings based on things like IQ anyway, right? We don't think that hinders our ability to respect one another, to find a different, better way to do it. And that might be difficult, right? But if this difference actually exists in things like IQ, it's going to be difficult anyway, based on where we are as a society right now. Surely it's better to know this in that case. Surely we'd be able to accommodate this. Surely we would still be able to respect other people based on who they are. Let me votes.
I'd thank that gentleman for his speech, and now for the final speech of this Proctor, it gives me great pleasure to call on the summary speakers from Harvard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Essentially, this debate is about what constitutes good science, where society can limit and say what science ought to be about. And secondly, what can you and what can you not do on a university campus? I think both issues are central to this debate. And thus, I'm going to summarize it in 3 points. First of all, on what grounds do we ever limit research? Secondly, can things go wrong if bad research comes out? And thirdly, what does it mean for teaching and universities to have these sorts of classes on their campus? So the first question is, on what grounds do you limit research? And now at first go, we get this idea about research being only about the pursuit of information, that more information is essentially better, gives us a better world. But implicitly, they already agree that we set limits on what science can and cannot do, things that you can and cannot publish. That is why we have things like methods and replicability that we require from sciences, because we think that it's good science. Secondly, we already have scientific ethics. We don't elect human subjects. We don't take into account research that has been done in human subjects, and we don't publish that in journals. This is also an example of scientific ethics. What does this mean? It means that we have a conception of what constitutes good science. This debate is about whether this conception should include things like discriminatory policies, things like discriminatory evidence. We say no. Reason being, we think equality is a fundamental tenet of our society. It is what we are built upon. This is how we treat each other, each individual in the society. And Ben gave you lots of arguments in here about how it's going to lead to more discriminatory policies, more discriminatory views in the society. We say, if it leads to alienation, if it leads to the situation where some parts of our society are being fundamentally discriminated against, we don't like that research. We don't think it ought to be out there. This is not us being scared. This is us saying firmly, we think there are some things that we ought not to look into because it changes the way we think about the world. And we like the way we think about the world right now. Sit down. Second question. What's the utilitarian calculus in here? Can things go wrong if there's more research out there? The first prop again comes out and says more research is more speech, and it's all good stuff because you have more views out there and you might have more evidence out there. Wrong. Ben gives you the argument about disproportionate effects on society. We say the fact that that sort of research occurs and comes out has a disproportionate effect. Immense harms. The marginal paper that goes against, proves that equality is good and people are not different, does not have that sort of effect. This is why the 2 types of speech, or 2 types of research, deserve different attention in here. No thank you. And then their argument goes, no guys, but there's counter speech, and there's counter research that you can publish. But they ignore all the analysis about how people who are biased are selected for information in the first place. They don't go around, oh, that paper proves me I'm wrong. I guess I'll change my worldview. That is not how people look into research. This is not how debate works. What's actually going to happen, their biases are going to be entrenched. People are going to be polarized further. And that is the reason why we don't want that sort of proof out there as well. No thank you. Second guy says, no, but things are not that bad because journals limit the certain type of research and types of papers that are published. We say, well, then you sort of agree that these ought not to be published in the first place, which we think is very nice of you to concede. Secondly, we say journals are not perfect. Journals can have a lot of stuff in them which is not, because of the immense amount of stuff that is submitted to journals, they're unable to verify all of it. We say bad stuff gets through. We need to go to the point where this information is stemming from, and that is the university who actually funds and takes on these projects. First guy.
If you think academia will try to teach students discriminatory ideas regarding race and sex, why, as Max asked and was never answered, do you trust that same entrenched academia to decide what does and does not have racist or sexist implications?
Right, so essentially your argument is sometimes the academic boards might make a mistake, and some research might not go out. We say we don't care. We say that is the price we have to pay, that is the bullet we're going to bite in this case. That has nothing to do with the point I was talking about. Now, a second guy goes on to tell us about how societies will change. It's sort of like, this is the argument about metrics, and how we will reevaluate what it means to be intelligent. This is so silly. First of all, they're extremely optimistic that society wants to advocate for equality in all cases, whereas we have centuries of history in which people want to be biased and selective and discriminatory. We don't see the grounds for optimism. But furthermore, if a study says that some groups are inherently less worthy because they are less intelligent, people are not going to say, oh, I guess I ought to reevaluate what it means to be intelligent. They say, ha, in your face, those groups deserve less, we ought to treat them like less. These are the conclusions that people take. No thank you. Lastly, they give us this point about, this is the second Gov's major extension about think tanks and how you can have think tanks that can still publish bad sort of science. We say, well, think tanks can counterbalance themselves. We say there's an equal probability that good science is going to take place in them. Secondly, we say universities have a unique obligation towards society. This is all the arguments that Ben gave you. So we frankly don't care about think tanks. We don't think that's an important argument in this debate. Lastly, we say think tanks like Brookings Institute don't do genetic research. This happens in universities that have billions of dollars to build a lab, that sort of stuff. Think tanks are simply out of the question. So I've proven to you, first of all, we have grounds to limit research. Secondly, things can go wrong if bad research is published. Let's go on to the third point. What is bad teaching? What is good teaching? Again, the second guy comes up here and we don't think that's the crux of the debate. The fact that the first missed it doesn't mean it's not the crux of the debate. We say two reasons. First of all, private universities have a right, based on their contracts essentially, to say what they want to give their funding to and what sort of science they want to fund. This got no response, so we only win in that sort of area. Secondly, we talked about public universities and how they carry a higher mission. We hold them to higher standards. This is a reason why on university campuses, for example, already hate speech is banned, although it's not banned in the rest of society in the US, because we hold these institutions to higher standards. Again, they were like, no, but it's not that clear cut. We say, yes it is, guys. Yes it is. You just fail to notice. Then the second part of this argument was about how it impacts the students on the campus. They're going to feel alienated. They're going to feel that the authority is attacking them. The authority meaning the professor. They gave us no explanation why students will be so critical. Students who already have a massive course load. Students who already defer to authority, who they believe has made up the best curriculum. We say in these instances, students are not going to be making the right call. We are proud to oppose.
I'd thank that gentleman for that speech and all of them for that debate. And I'd like to encourage them to cross the floor, shake hands, and I'd like to encourage all of you to go away as quickly as you can. That includes the